Hello, welcome to this humanitarian talk on innovative financing to support climate action in humanitarian situations. You are joining a distinguished panel, including Mr. Stuart Maniruguha, who is the Director of Plantations Development in the National Forestry Authority in Uganda. We'll also have Mr. Peter Reynolds, partner and head of the Greater China offices and leader on sustainability in the Asia Pacific region of Oliver Wyman, the global management consulting firm, and Mr. Mike Inkstadt, who is head of water, energy, and transport division of GIZ of the German Development Cooperation Agency. So my name is Irene Sun. I am the team lead on innovative financing at UNHCR. And I just want to frame our discussion on innovative financing to support climate action in humanitarian situations before we bring on our distinguished panel. Now, the reason we're having this discussion right now is that the world has been seeing a big confluence in terms of the twin crises of human displacement and climate change. So as the audience, you may or may not be aware, but 90% of refugees and 70% of conflict IDPs, these are internally displaced people, originate from the climate vulnerable countries, right? And so in a nutshell, what that means is that the same places that are affected by the worst conflicts are also the same places that are dealing with the worst aspects of climate change. Now, why are we connecting these twin crises to the notion of innovative financing? I'm sure if you're tuning in, you already know that one of the perennial challenges of doing humanitarian work is that the budgets have been for years now extremely overstretched for humanitarian issues. Last year, for example, UNHCR declared the most emergencies that had ever been declared in a single year. And this was last year before Ukraine erupted as the latest crisis. And so we need to find new ways to finance urging pressing issues, including on climate action and climate change. And that's where innovative financing comes in. Now, there's many definitions of innovative financing, but I'll just pose one as a working definition for this discussion, which is that innovative financing is a toolkit that goes beyond grants to bring in more sustainable, efficient, and effective resourcing for the benefit of refugees, host communities, and other people of concern, including other displaced people. Now, this is obviously a very broad definition. Anything that goes beyond grants or different financial instruments used in combination of grants. And it can be used to do many things. And so it can be used, for example, to scale up programming in climate action, whether that's in forestry or clean energy. You can use it to build higher quality infrastructure. So, for example, to transition infrastructure that's currently running on diesel or fossil fuels to solar or renewable energy. You could use it to become more efficient, for example, to spur scale in order to lower costs, which then frees up that funding for refugee and other needs of people of concern. And of course, you can invest in the productive capacities of refugees and host communities and other local communities. So that's just a starting definition to set the scene. Now, I would now we'll turn to the panel, and I'll ask a round of opening questions, and we'll have a discussion from there. You'll see at the bottom, audience, if you have questions and comments you would like the panel to address, please go to the link on the rolling yellow text and submit your comments and questions, and we'll be sure to pick those up, as many as we can, towards the end of the session. Now, I'd like to bring in Stuart first, and as a reminder to the audience, Stuart comes to us from the National Forestry Authority in Uganda, where he is the Director of Plantations Development. Welcome, Stuart. Now, I would like you to help us set the scene. For the audience members who don't know, Uganda is a country that really encapsulates the twin issues that I just mentioned around human displacement and climate change. Uganda is one of the most generous refugee hosting countries in the world. It's also a country that is experiencing one of the highest rates of forest loss in the world. And so with that in mind, Stuart, can you help us paint the picture a little bit on what it's like on the ground in Uganda? What are the needs? What can be done about it? What are you and the government doing? What are partners doing? What do you need to see more of?
Thank you so much, Irene. First of all, I want to thank the organizers of this humanitarian forum for having given myself in particular an opportunity to be part of the panel, but also having considered National Forest Authority and Uganda at large. As you ably said, Uganda has an open door policy to refugees. And this has put the country into a situation where we find we are receiving very many people, given the turbulence of countries around us. So we receive people from Congo, we receive people from Southern Sudan, we have people from Rwanda, we have people from Burundi, all around East Africa and beyond. They are all here, and the government here has really felt it important that we do that humanitarian role by welcoming all human beings that are forced into migration to be able to find space where they can be able to be comforted and then have the beginning of another life away from their home. So that clearly has put the country into many thoughts of planning and trying to see how we can make the host communities and the displaced people at peace, and then avail the resources, the basic resources required to be able to have a harmonious coexistence. So the Ugandan government therefore had to put in its arrangement the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, the CRF, which has been directly embedded into the operations. And this comes in direct because the country has also put a dedicated ministry to look at the refugees. And these are managed under the office of the Prime Minister, where all the planning, all the activities of refugees are coordinated at national level. So the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework comes into directly falling into the government planning, and therefore the government looked at how we can incorporate all other plans that would be befitting for the displaced people to be able to enjoy their stay. And the specific is the Water and Environment Sector Response Plan. And that plan aims at looking at issues of sanitation and hygiene, looking at water, and also looking at issues of energy, and then the environment that must be conserved to have both the water resources and energy sustainably supplied. So from there, now we are able to develop projects that are very well directly anchoring into the sector response plans as put at national level. And therefore, what the country is doing is that it goes down to look at these individuals and persons of concern who come into the country, and then put them in settlements. But key to note is that we do not have camps in Uganda. These people come and find themselves mingling with the entire community. So they become part of the community. So when we are planning for them, we look at the landscape, the refugees and the host communities, because they have issues now that are cross-cutting and affecting them in all equal measure. So in the sector of water and environment, now that is where we are linking in to do specific projects. And in this case, National Forestry Authority has been able to implement an ambitious project with United Nations High Commission for Refugees, which we are calling a reforestation project. And this project is addressing those four aspects. It is addressing energy, it is addressing water through conservation efforts, the restoration of degraded ecosystems, and then it is looking at food security. We want to thank particularly United Nations High Commission for Refugees that since 2019 up to date, they have injected in money to a tune of about Uganda shillings 8 billion to be able to respond to issues that come with the numbers that come into the country, and then trying to address the pressures on environment while addressing the restoration. So we are looking at that in that angle, but as you ably said, our engagements here are not a bit predictable. When there is a stretch on the humanitarian requirement by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, then we are finding a bit of constraint in terms of financing. The starting of the project was injecting in actually about 3.2 billion Uganda shillings. The second year, this money reduced to about 1.4 because of the needs. That was 2020. Now the COVID issues come in and other issues. The 2021, the budget as well reduced to about 1.5. But the argument from the side, our side, is that these interventions we are doing are not real-time interventions. They require a lot of time and patience. If we must be able to realize the impact in terms of restoration of the environment, in terms of developing wood roads, you need at least 3 years of the consistent financing of the interventions to be able to realize the impact. Of course, I want to indicate that this year, 2022, while we were planning, we thought we would get about 5 billion Uganda shillings. But because of need and the overstretching of the budget, UNHCR was able to ask us to make 3 priorities. We had 3 priority levels, and the priority 1 is what now has attracted funding, which is a tune of 2.28 billion Uganda shillings. So what happens to the other activities within the priority 2 and priority 3? Of course, without sustainable financing, those now are forgotten. And we are not sure of what will happen in the 2023 if the crisis we are seeing across the world keeps expanding. So that is where we are, and those are the directions we are looking at as government. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stuart. I think you have set the scene perfectly in terms of painting a real picture of the needs on the ground. Uganda as a prime example of a country that's exceedingly generous in hosting refugees, and again, not having an encampment policy. And so refugees are living side by side with Ugandan nationals. But there's also many needs: environmental needs, water, energy needs. And you know what to do. You know what projects need to happen on the ground. You've started them. You gave the example of this reforest project, which is a great example. But then the funding need, when it's humanitarian funding, year on year, you can get half of what you need. And of course, trees, to your point, take way more than 1 year to grow. And so if you start something and then the next year you can't fund it, it's a huge waste. And so the sustainability, the predictability of financing is a huge need. And I think that's a perfect transition to bring in Peter. We'll have Stuart coming back, but we'll give a chance to our other panelists. And Peter, I want you to pick up from where Stuart left off, which is you're from Oliver Wyman, one of the expert firms on financing issues, on environment and other issues. So can you bring in that angle, that expertise on financing, and describe what are some of the ways to address the needs that Stuart is seeing on the ground in Uganda? And can you get specific around an innovative financing modality that you find promising to address this kind of need around the need for sustainable and predictable funding in environmental issues?
Thanks, Irene, and thanks for having me. It's a big shoes to follow Stuart on this as well. So yeah, I mean, I guess, where do we come from? So Oliver Wyman, we do a lot of work with the private sector. So we've been doing a lot of work with alliances recently. We supported GFANZ, which is the big private sector financial services initiative that led into Glasgow around climate change. And specifically embedded within that was, how do we catalyze private sector financing activity to really help emerging markets and developing countries? So embedded in that was a big question around sort of humanitarian aid. There's, I think, one piece of this is sort of the activities of the multilateral development banks. So there's been a lot of pressure from the big shareholders of some of the multilateral development banks to make sure that they're really crowding in rather than crowding out, which was the old debate, private sector funding, because I think there is a real role for private sector here in generating the size and scale that's necessary to have the transformational impact, but also that stability across the board. We've done multiple pieces of work with multilateral development banks. So I've personally served the Green Climate Fund as an example, who are, I think, a really interesting organization in that they have kind of purposefully been set up as a mechanism by which financing can be made available to catalytic climate change related initiatives in developing countries. And so while there are teething problems and challenges with getting that funding flowing through in many cases, some of the projects and the size and scale that they've now managed to get to, I think, is really, really impressive. So I guess at the top of the house, I think there are all sorts of pieces there. And there's more and more, I think, as we see kind of stakeholder capitalism, which has taken a big jump forward with Ukraine situation, but even before that was clearly important, but also climate taking center stage. As kind of ESG becomes not just a side pocket that's a sort of charitable endeavor, but more a core strategy. Those pieces are all kind of leading to an environment today that I think is really interesting. So the public sector, the private sector, and governments all coming together to think about kind of how this financing should flow. You asked about specifics, Irene. So you teed me up for a project we did together to talk a little bit about that, if that's okay. So yeah, we worked really closely with the UNHCR now over the past almost a year and a bit to try and develop a kind of funding modality to support refugees in reducing their environmental footprint. So a lot of the environmental footprint around refugees, especially in those countries where they're still in camps, it relates to deforestation, because effectively the refugees are heading out to gather wood in order to use that as a fuel to cook, and they're cooking that on a really inefficient fuel stove. And so the idea that we'd come up with, it's been launched now. We hope that it really has legs. Is could we create a separate funding modality, a separate fund, effectively, which had certain types of benefits, and the specific benefits it would have are if we could find carbon project developers who would support the initiatives to either reforest areas that have been deforested by refugees, potentially also including the refugees in that process as a means to help them, give them something to do and a job and a little bit of a cash incentive. Give the host countries also a much better feeling in terms of kind of what that refugee population is like. Start reforesting and using sustainable forestry practices, and also pay for the use of enhanced cook stoves. Might it be possible for us to essentially generate carbon credits off the back of that, which would allow this fund to be self-funding effectively through this period of time? And it turns out the answer is also yes. I mean, there's a huge amount of risk and uncertainty embedded in that. But given the sort of size and scale of the voluntary carbon market as it sits today, and the price of carbon perpetually getting higher and higher, especially carbon that is wrapped with a social positive element associated with it, we actually can develop modalities that effectively are self-funding over a reasonable amount of time. They need an injection of cash today, but they're self-funding thereafter. And that then becomes really appealing to the private sector, because the private sector doesn't feel great about carbon offsets. They don't feel great about kind of their own activity in this space. And foundations in the private sector, I think, are really, really interested in mechanisms that multiply the impact that they can potentially have. And so this structure we have kind of developed then allows for a pretty substantial impact. We think there's sort of 25 million trees a year can be planted, 75,000 hectares, 2.5 million tons of carbon dioxide could potentially be mitigated. So the environmental impact is substantial, but also the impact on the refugee population is substantial by giving them, potentially an activity, allowing that to be financed, because this is not a job. So quite often they don't have permission to work, but they can do things to improve the environment within which they live. So this would qualify from that perspective. It would reduce, importantly, gender-based violence, because quite often it's women and children who are going out to forage for the wood. So by putting that in place, the average refugee, I think, Irene, you'll know this better than me, has been now 10 years in their camp. That's the average. So you have multiple generations of refugees born in the same place. The size and scale of the environmental footprint that we quantified is really substantial. So people have to go further. And clearly, from a host community perspective, Stuart was super graceful, and I think it's amazing what's being done in Uganda. Like, that's really warming. But there is clearly still a tension that exists in some of the countries in which refugees currently are domiciled, and as a result, they are, this would reduce potentially the sort of the tension that exists between host communities. So we really like it as a construct, but the core of it remains an idea that is sort of self-funding. It's been launched on the UNHCR side of things. We think it's really cool, but just an idea there, sort of an example of the type of thing. But all of that overarching perspective I gave at the very beginning, I think is true. Like, there is a huge degree of excitement and desire to get innovative financing modalities in, as the private sector, multilateral development banks, and governments will start to work together. Irene, hopefully that's enough.
Oh, thank you so much, Peter. We'll certainly bring you back in a few moments. And thank you for setting the scene around how actually private sector can help finance some of the needs that Stuart's experiencing in Uganda and others are experiencing in other countries hosting refugees. Now I want to turn to Mike. And as a reminder, Mike comes to us from GIZ, German Cooperation Agency, where he's the head of Water, Energy, and Transport Division. And Mike, as GIZ, you sit actually between country governments and the private sector, and you're trying to make everything work so that social and environmental benefit can occur. And in your position, you also see many aspects of climate. You see, we've been talking a lot about forestry and environmental issues, but there's also the whole clean energy side, which is a huge need, particularly in developing countries, particularly in humanitarian situations. So can you bring in that perspective on how development organizations like you have been starting to work in humanitarian situations with different kinds of actors? And again, I'll ask you to ground, to really share a specific experience as a window into sharing your perspective as a development organization.
Yes, certainly. Thank you very much, Irene, for this kind introduction, and thanks to the organizers of the forum here to invite GIZ to contribute to the agenda. I want to share with you a little story about a journey that GIZ and UNHCR undertook jointly over the last couple of years, I would say, in the field of clean energy for displacement settings. And it really addresses two, let's say, elements or opportunities of innovative financing. One is private sector mobilization, and the other is how you can use grant funding in a smart way, so that it sort of revolves and can be used for mobilizing even more private sector investment. So the journeys really started a couple of years ago when we had a first dialogue with UNHCR about the situation of energy supply in many of UNHCR's displacement settings and field offices. And I think it was understood or problematized that they were largely based on diesel generators that provided electricity to these camps for water pumping, for other forms for lighting, for charging mobile phones, and whatever is needed in terms of electricity in such a setting. And the situation was considered to be, let's say, suboptimal, not very good one. For many reasons. One is certainly the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated, and I mean the entire UN system is also on its way to decarbonize its operations, so that was a challenge. But maybe even more of immediate concern was the costs that were associated with the solution, in the sense that you had to provide for the capital investment for the diesel generators, but then also have a continuous bill for the fuel that is needed, often in settings where providing that type of fuel of very far out distance, far away from ports or refineries or other supply infrastructure. So also often very unreliable form. Then also a lot of issues with the operation of the machines, of the diesel generators. They break down. You need somebody to come out to camp to repair them. So a whole lot of issues associated, but a lot of them also found their expression in the costs that were associated with the solution. And at GIZ, we had over the last decade made a number of, let's say, experiences with situations where we helped organizations or also private sector companies to replace that form of traditional diesel generator-based electricity with a combination of solar and battery systems that could replace these diesel generators. And but the idea there is not to just replace the let's say the machinery or the investment, but also to come to a new form of sourcing your energy supply through an energy service approach, as we call it. That means you as an energy consumer, you don't have to install your own generators, but you enter into a contract with a private entity that supplies the electricity to you. So as an energy consumer, you don't have to take that major capital investment, but you basically pay by the kilowatt hour of electricity that you buy. And that has a number of advantages. First of all, you don't have the capital expenditure. You don't have to look after the operations of the infrastructure. And it's also the opportunity really to mobilize the private sector investment for the capital expenditure that is needed in such systems. So that seemed then also an option for displacement settings. As GIZ, we have had a wide experience in providing such services or making such transition possible in other settings, especially with a lot of private sector firms as energy consumers, medium-sized companies where we would assist and help to come to such solutions. Here, this was a new challenge. The displacements settings of UNHCR were special challenges so to say. So over the last couple of years, we worked very, very closely with colleagues at UNHCR to address the associated challenges in terms of procurement standards with the UN, within the UN system, in terms of the technical standards that are needed, in terms of the training of operators of such systems, and also in terms of the legal foundations that are needed to enter into such energy service contracts. So that worked quite well. We have now achieved a number of such transitions where in field offices of UNHCR, in particular Africa, Uganda, Ethiopia, such new systems have now been installed and are in operation, and they are working. And so the question that then came up next was, what can be done to scale up this model? And what we understood together with our colleagues from the UNHCR was that the, let's say, limitations to enter into long-term off-taker contracts for UNHCR posed a challenge, because often it was not possible from a legal or financial point of view for UNHCR to enter into contracts with private operators for more than, let's say, 2 or 3 years. And that makes it very hard for a private company to come to a business model where this would work. So they need these private service companies need a longer perspective. And UNHCR has been working on a model which is called the Green Financing Facility, which is operates as a form of guarantee for a longer term perspective for these off-taker agreements. So if for any reason, maybe because the camp does stop to exist, no, and UNHCR would not be able to purchase the electricity anymore, this facility can come in as a guarantor, so that that the business model and the revenue stream for the private operator would not falter. This makes it much easier for a private sector company to operate, to enter into such a contract with an agency such as UNHCR. And we've been working very closely with the colleagues at the UNHCR to establish, improve this grant mechanism that really works as a guarantee to mobilize more and more private sector investment for clean energy supply to displacement settings.
Thank you so much, Mike, for raising that example, because it's again, drawing a commonality with the problem that Stuart painted, which is, the technical solutions are actually there, and they've existed for a while now. The question is, how do you transition? How do you finance the transition? How do you support the scale up so that all of those that really could make use of these technical solutions, whether it's in clean energy or it's in forestry or in water, can avail themselves of it? Now, I want to bring in the whole panel now, because it's time, I think, for you guys to speak to each other a bit. But before I do that, I just want to point the audience to this scrolling text. So we really welcome your questions and your comments. And you can go to your web browser, sli.do, and enter this code EHF-HT2 and click on our session, which is on innovative financing to support climate action in humanitarian situations, to enter your comments and questions, and we will be sure to pick those up in just a few minutes. So in the meantime, to our distinguished panel, so we've painted the picture a little bit of what the problems are, what some of the potential solutions are. So Peter spoke about carbon financing, Mike spoke about a guarantee fund. So if both the technical solutions and the financing solutions are so clear from experts like you, what's the problem then? As in, what in your experience are the pitfalls? And maybe we'll go around very quickly and have each of you name the top pitfall. I'll force you to name just one that in your experience causes promising projects to fail? So Stuart, we'll come back to you.
Thank you so much, Irene, and thanks to Peter and Mike for the great insights. Yes, of course, as you indicate, what tops my list is the issue of carbon financing. We have ratified many protocols here, including the recent the Paris Agreement, which actually was very critical in issues of climate financing through REDD+ initiatives. And here we seem not yet able to realize the fruits of the most talked about carbon financing, even when all of these efforts are being done. Yes, we have as a country the REDD+ strategy and action plan, but these voluntary carbon markets seem not to have really been appreciated at local level for us to be able to see the incentive that would actually come with the initiatives that are being done to be able to give us a guarantee of predictable financing that is sustainable. So what are we not doing right? I think I will pose that question so that we are able to know what is required to be able to attract the buyers and also get into this market, because I do feel we are better placed as a country to be able to benefit and move our efforts quite forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Stuart. So the question of how are these mechanisms translating or not translating on the ground when they're meant to be supporting countries on the front line of climate change, but how can countries like Uganda access them? So same question to Peter. What's the top challenge that you've experienced that causes projects to fail?
So maybe take, you asked for one top project. So I think the problem, and I think it answers a little bit Stuart's question, is I don't think we yet have real clarity on what I might call impact risk or the sort of volatility around impact. So really what we're talking about here are, in many cases, financial investors who are quite cognizant of financial risks and the mechanisms that we've kind of generated to quantify those risks and then to charge for them. I feel like in impact, so what we're talking about here are things with two bottom lines, effectively, and so that second bottom line, like quantifying the impact that could potentially have on the environment or other pieces, and the volatility of that potential impact itself, and how much volatility you're willing to take, I think is really important. And it's sort of a strange concept, Irene. That's probably not what you expected me to say in terms of what has made this fail. But I think it makes the market not yet exist, to Stuart's question around what have you done right. Like, this transition needs to happen from it being a sort of charitable endeavor to a functioning market, I think, for it to really get scale. And that's going to require quite a lot of development of sort of the infrastructure that's required around that market, the history, the information, the data, other pieces associated with it too. And I think as a result, the only positive note to leave on that is sort of all of these markets have sort of bumbled along for a while and then suddenly taken off. The hope is obviously that sudden takeoff in this space happens relatively quickly. But I think it's sort of the data, information, transparency, taxonomy, common sort of standards, all the rest of it that should be in place for this market to really work that are not there yet. And that leaves people really kind of concerned about potentially the lack of impact and the risk around that.
Now, I think you put it very well that in carbon financing, parts of it are working, but overall, it's not quite yet a market yet. And markets bumble along and don't work until sometimes all of a sudden they do. But all of these things have to come together for a market to function. Mike, coming to you, obviously you brought in the clean energy perspective, but overall you have a very broad purview. What in your experience are causing projects, well-intentioned, good ideas to fail?
Well, it's not only about failures, but it's also about making best use of new emerging opportunities that are often related to new business models, to new technological options that you have. I mean, making the interface between the public agencies like GIZ or UNHCR or other government or parastatal or international organizations on the one hand, and the private sector companies on the other hand, to make that interface work is challenging if you go beyond, let's say, conventional procurement. Conventional procurement, where you just buy a product, let's say, as a public agency, that's pretty established business. But to enter into service contracts, especially in a also emerging new field of the renewable energy sector with new technologies, new opportunities, but also new business models. To make that interface work is challenging on both sides. Let's see, if you look at it from the perspective of public agencies, adjusting your procurement standards, rules, procedures to a mode where you don't buy a product, but you buy a service over a longer period of time is quite a challenge. I mean, we've also gone through that in my own organization, and I think it's also still a long way to go. We've also worked with your colleagues, Irene and UNHCR, to address these issues. But at the same time, it's also for the private sector to understand the logics, the let's say annual budgets that our organizations work with. It's very different from when you work business to business and you have a partner who has a completely different, let's say, way to look at the business model and the budgeting process and so forth. So making these two worlds match is a challenge, not in the sense that it has led to failures, but in the sense that there's much more opportunity in this area. And to reap that, I think, well, obviously dialogue, but also technical assistance, advisory work is necessary both towards the agencies, but also towards private sector companies. So that you can really reap those opportunities.
Thank you so much, Mike. And you very cleverly, I think, put in two challenges or failure reasons in your response. Very, very clever of you when I asked for one around, the sectors not understanding each other and it being a challenge to work together, public sector understanding private sector and vice versa. And then also identifying the challenge of the systems involved, whether it's procurement or budgeting, which are still geared, most of them, towards this old style of doing things, single year budgets in humanitarian situations, old style procurement processes, even though we're trying to transition to a new world where the financing and the support of different issues like clean energy and environmental issues can be supported in a smarter, more efficient way. Now, I want to turn to the floor and widen the conversation. And so first, I'd like to bring in the OECD, and we have a representative from the OECD, Mr. Jens Sediment, who is head of climate change and the environment team in the Development Cooperation Directorate of the OECD. And so thank you, Jens, for joining us and for kicking off interventions from the floor to this conversation. And Jens, I'd like you to speak about, based on OECD's research, which is quite extensive on the topic of green financing, What policies or recommendations do you have for spurring the development of climate action using new financing modalities?
Many thanks, Irene, and many thanks for having me with you. It's a fascinating discussion. So as you said, I focus on questions of climate, environmental cooperation and finance in the context of development cooperation. And clearly the question on mobilization and innovation around this is central to that. Now, I admit that on the humanitarian side, I have not so much engaged extensively so far, but it's clearly a fascinating and very relevant discussion. And maybe just to say that colleagues of ours from the International Network on Conflict and Fragility of the Development Assistance Committee, they do regularly look at the financing of refugee situations, and also clearly identified the need to think and go beyond just a focus on public funding mechanisms. So, I think we've had great examples here, but let me try to pull out a few messages, I think, that have come out of our work, in particularly with a focus on blended finance, which in essence we define at the OECD as was referred to before, crowding in and unlocking private financial resources to address development problems. And so I think in terms of the basic recommendations that we've encapsulated in some principles, I think a first one is to really, as a public actor with development and policy-based money to spend, to really base yourself on achieving your policy objectives. And then the question is really, what is the most effective way of using your limited resources to achieve those policy objectives? That's what I think should be driving yourself, because obviously, as we heard, resources are scarce, and it's essential to understand, regardless of that, whether that be grants, loans, some risk mitigation mechanisms such as guarantees, etc. Whatever the structure is, I think the question is, how does it help you achieve, some of your specific policy objectives? I think the other point also that is essential is to reflect, and again, it's a point that came up, how does it help increase the overall pie that is available for resource being spent on your policy objectives? And again, I think, we heard a lot about the point of framing the investments in a way that they basically bring in additional resources that help, do that in the area of humanitarian funding. Then maybe another point is really thinking about, what is it that you want your partner, or sort of, your additional financing source to bring? Because I think, we've in various areas in development cooperation for quite a long time, we've seen a focus on private finance, private investment, but sometimes that has been framed very much just from the perspective of, this is what we want, this is what we need. I think partnership is key in this, and partnership means understanding, on the one hand, what you expect from those you're reaching out with, but also what's required for your partners to work. And I think that means more concretely that you need to understand and enable each partner to engage on the basis of their respective mandate and obligation while respecting the other's mandate. And fundamentally, if we talk about, for instance, mobilizing private finance, there is a need to make sure that somewhere there's a business model and an investment model that works financially for the private actors. And then around that, you can see that you allocate risk in a targeted, balanced, and sustainable manner. And again, I think it's coming back to the same point, to aim for sustainability. And finally, I think it's also essential to monitor how things are working. And we heard that point also in the conversation. But I think fundamentally, if you take a step back and look at it, it's very much about looking at common sense. Again, how do you use resources efficiently? If you can spend a small amount of resources to solve a problem by unlocking others, who would not do that? I think that's, again, a lot comes back to this question of how is it possible to create market solutions of some sort? Because if you can create a market, basically the market itself provides the sustainability of dealing with a problem. And fundamentally, it allows public finance to exit, and it allows, I guess, also for humanitarian funding and efforts. The basic goal is to be able to exit because the situation has been addressed. I think there's just one or two other quick points maybe before I close. There's, I think, a fundamental question of, especially as we address climate and environmental issues, how do you monetize the externalities, or positive externalities? And that goes to the question of revenue streams and the examples of carbon credit, because you need to have this revenue stream to be able to capture the environmental and developmental goods that are associated with us. And I think a very final point that also came through in Mike's intervention is the question of, how are development institutions set up to do that, about doing things differently? What are the organizational methods? What are the staff incentives and the KPIs in terms of how you use your resources? And that is always, as we look across the board of development finance, that's fundamental of how these institutions work. And I think making sure that within the institutions and also within the, to the extent that donors provide funding to institutions, they create this and support this enabling environment to do innovative approaches and get them to scale. So with that, many thanks for being part of this discussion, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Jens. You picked up a lot of aspects which, to your point, should be common sense, but in our world today, unfortunately, common sense is not necessarily so common. To the audience, thank you for submitting comments and questions. We'll turn to some of them now, but we are still welcoming comments and questions. And if you'd like to contribute, please, you see the sliding text on the screen. Please go to sli.do and enter EHF-HT2, where you'll be given a chance to select our session where you can contribute your comments and questions. So actually, I want to pick up, I think Jens made a nice bridge to an audience question directed at Peter regarding how is it that we can attract investors to entering low-income country markets. Investors are understood to perhaps be risk-averse. Is blended finance the right way to go? Peter, over to you.
It's a tough question. We surveyed a number of investors on climate and especially climate in emerging markets related questions. And their biggest concern is lack of bankable projects, lack of investable projects. And so I find that this market fascinating because you have this situation where there's clearly an absolutely massive need, and at the same time, investors effectively saying that there aren't enough projects that they can go and put this money towards, despite the fact there's been a huge amount of funds flowing into ESG related financing. So the market's not clearing. So I think it is precisely the core question here. I mean, I think there are all sorts of risk mitigants that can happen. So blended finance is one piece. It's definitely effective. You're seeing public-private partnerships grow and grow and grow in blended models. Just as Jens mentioned earlier, right? Like there's more and more attractiveness there. And I think it requires the organizations to learn to work together, as Mike brought up before. So I think blended finance is a good way of de-risking it. I think there are other questions too, though, that are really kind of challenging here. Quite often there's a questions around foreign exchange. So the risk around FX, especially in some emerging markets, is really critical. So how do you effectively manage that? Even if you provide US dollar-based funding, you effectively end up with the FX risk because if the expectation is that this is going to provide you payback in energy or other types of activity, that energy pricing is going to fluctuate with local market currencies. And then there are obviously political risks in many of the countries that we're talking about here. Kind of how do you make sure that you're essentially insulating against that? I know that the African Development Bank has got some proposals out at the moment for really quite innovative methods to try and develop effectively insurance policies or other types of pieces there, which actually have the ability to be then seeded into the private insurance market for managing those. So I think blended finance is important and a key part of this, but I think there are other pieces of the ecosystem that are still kind of being created to make sure that these are attractable places to invest.
Thanks so much, Peter. We only have 5 minutes left, and I do want to direct a couple of other audience questions to our other panel members. We have a very smart audience. So Mike, I want to turn to you. Have you been seeing donors have some kind of tension or make trade-offs between funding innovative financing projects versus the traditional humanitarian needs? And if so, how do you mitigate? And I'll ask you to be brief because we have one more question to get through. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Irene. Maybe there's one question that comes to my mind when looking at that question here that I think has taken a lot of center stage recently in the development finance debate, and that's the question of guarantees. I mean, there is obviously on paper, there's a great advantage in terms of efficiency of resources when you can use development funding as a guarantee instead of making the investment or even providing a grant. But at the same time, I do see a lot of hesitancy whether the framework conditions in many of the countries we're talking about are ripe for investors to go ahead and only rely on often very smart financing mechanisms and guarantee mechanisms, guarantee schemes. So I wouldn't really want to take a strong position on that, but I think it's really worth digging into a little bit deeper and trying really to understand where and in what conditions guarantee can provide the right answer, but also identify those where you probably need a slightly more traditional approach in order to really get the projects that Peter mentioned are so scarce for investors to engage in.
No, it's true. Innovative financing obviously can't solve all the needs, and when applied to the wrong problem, it's a waste of resources and effort. So Stuart, I want to come to you and give you the last word on our panel. We have a question from the audience regarding when you mentioned you had prioritize and choose top priorities. What is the criteria that you use to make those decisions? Is it social impact?
Oh, thank you so much, Irene, and thanks to the audience for the question. Yes, I talked about priorities when I was making reference to the project we are implementing with UNHCR, where I talked about 4 areas we are focusing on. These were picked from the Water and Environment Sector Response Plan. And during that planning, we were able to do assessments at 2 levels. We looked at the needs assessment and then the impact assessment. And these 2 were able to guide us to the interventions that we are focusing our energies on now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stuart, for being succinct and direct in your response. We are unfortunately out of time. It's been an incredibly rich discussion on innovative financing to support climate action in humanitarian situations. I just want to close by recapping a little bit some of the themes. Of course, there were many other important issues brought up, but some of the themes around the need for better financing, innovative financing models in climate action. The needs are great. Oftentimes the technical solutions have actually already been evident and identified. And the question is more about how to scale up those technical solutions using sustainable and innovative financing modalities. It requires different sectors working together. And in that, we had perspectives from our distinguished panel representing different sectors. And so with that, I would like to thank our panel, which included Mr. Stuart Maniruguha, Director of Plantations Development from the National Forestry Authority of Uganda, Mr. Peter Reynolds, who's partner and head of the Greater China offices at Oliver Wyman, and Mr. Mike Enkstadt, who is head of Water, Energy and Transport Division at GIZ. And I also want to thank Mr. Jens Sedemund of the OECD for contributing his remarks as well. So thank you, audience, for your questions, for your interest in this important topic, and we wish you a good rest of the European Humanitarian Forum. Thank you.